Hello and welcome to week 12 of my weekly wrap-up. I am a Master of Forestry student at Northern Arizona University. This is my second semester. I am taking 3 classes: forest insects, ecological economics, and an independent study. So this week for my insects class we looked at pest control. There are 3 basic methods. We looked at biological, and in that there are 3 basic ones. There's classical, and that, even though it started, the first record of it is 304 AD. In the US biology, the concept really began in the 1870s. It is from a cottony cushion scale. You may remember we talked about scales, I think, last week. It's a type of insect, and it has, no, it's 2 weeks ago. It has a very thick outer shell scale, so if you spray it, it's very protected. This particular cottony cushiony scale was having its way with the citrus trees in Florida, in California, and they realized it came from Australia, so they found out a Vidalia beetle was its natural enemy in Australia. They brought that ladybug over to California, and it was extremely successful. One of the reasons it was successful is because the ladybug had a very narrow food source, so it was a specialist on the cottony cushion scale, so it didn't get out into the larger landscape. It also had a small temperature range, so it was confined, and that is one of the reasons that it worked. It led to a lot of other biological control issues, attempts, and my professor said about 5% of them are successful, and I kind of panicked. I thought, yeah, the other 95 are disasters, but he said 5% are successful, about 10% are disasters, and the other 85, they just don't work. They're failures because the predator that is brought over to take care of the invasive insect just doesn't take hold. One of the things that happens with biological classical control is that the predator that is brought over establishes, and so it can consistently maintain the level of the insect that was creating the damage. The second form is augmentation. This is safer. This one is pretty cool. It's just like this mass release of the predator onto the insect area, and they put out more predators than there are insects of concern, so that they eat up all the insects, and then the rest of the predators, they just die out, so they are not persistent in the landscape. And that happens a lot in greenhouses. If you remember from last week, I talked about the white flies, one word, so they're not real flies. And greenhouses will release a parasitoid wasp of some kind that eats on those white flies, and they release more wasps than there are the aphids, the white flies. And once all the aphids are eaten up, then the wasp they die from starvation, so they don't persist, and they're not a continuous problem. Conservational is the third type of biological control, and this is where you have a native pest, but it's not as strong as you need it to be for the native insect that's causing concerns. So you have to ask, why is it not as strong as it ought to be in that landscape? And within that, you need to look at its roosting sites. Maybe you need to examine if it should have a better overwintering location. Does it have a secondary host that is absent from the landscape at this point in time? You need to look at the toxicity, maybe back off of the pesticides, and that's why we have lost the predator part of the predator-prey aspect of these insects. And the other one is just the best answer that I've had in school so far, which is you need to look at its food source. And many of these parasitoid wasps, they're very tiny, but they're pollinators. And so flowers are the answer. The more flowers you plant, the more food source that the little wasps have, and that means then they are available in your landscape to be able to help take care of the insects that are out of control. So that's really exciting news. Let's see. Oh, I forgot to mention that in the classical, when you're bringing in, it's an exotic predator for an exotic pest, and it could just be from like Georgia to South Carolina. It doesn't have to be intercontinental to be part of that classical control. All right. Oh, and then we looked at this very intimidating example. It was the little fire ant in Hawaii. It is an amazingly well-adapted invasive species. It can spread 500 meters a year, which is pretty good for an insect. It also can float on debris. It can live in wet or dry habitats. It is out during the day and the night. It has nests that can be underground, above ground, or in a tree. And if you disturb its nest, it doesn't care because it doesn't have a permanent nest, so it just moves to another location. There's several different queens in a colony, and so it's easy when they get split up for a new queen to just establish the colony, a second colony, and those colonies collaborate. They are not competitive as in certain other species. The ants are really aggressive to native ants, and they can cause blindness in pets. Oh, and they farm aphids. First of all, they're generalist in their food habit, but also they farm aphids. They really like the honeydew that comes out of the aphid's abdomen when they are feeding into the plant, mostly into the leaves. And so the little fire ant will protect the aphid so that no other species will eat it, and that means they get to have the honeydew residue from the aphids. So plus on top of all of that, they have a very painful sting, and the whelps from the sting can last for weeks. So they can be a big problem. We got to do an insect management plan on them and come up with different scenarios that we thought might work. In reality, what they have done is put out poisonous baits. So the ants will go out and they'll collect that bait in some form of some sugary substance, because that's the thing that they like, you know, from the honeydew. But then they take that poisonous bait back to the queen and it kills them. But they are a serious problem in many places, not just in Hawaii. Let's see. Oh, and then we looked back again just for a moment at the Nematode wasps from South Africa. They had that wasp infestation problem in the pine plantations. They brought in the nematodes, but they were producing the nematodes in the stage where the nematode just eats the fungus, and they needed it to be in the stage that eats the wasp. Well, the way that they knew which nematode to bring in was from genetic identification. There are people that just like can get an insect and like the wasp they took, and they could identify which part of the world it came from, and from that's how they were able to identify the parasite that would be able to be its native natural enemy, and they brought it from that area over to the plantations in South Africa, and solved that issue for them. So our word for insects is haplodiploid. That happens to be what that wasp is. It means that the female, she can lay unfertilized eggs and they become male, or she can lay fertilized eggs and they become females. So if you have one wasp, you can end up with an infestation. Haplodiploid, haplodiploid. All right. Environmental economics, we moved on and we are now looking at policy and governance, and the whole point of that is how you can make things work better. And the study of economics, she said, is also to make better decisions. So I thought that was really cool Summary of my class. We mostly looked at the interactions of various policies and some of the unintended consequences that come from them. When you are looking at the policies, you need to ask several questions. One, what issue is the policy intended to address? What economic principle or principles is the intervention employing? And the intervention is the policy that you're trying to intervene in some problem. The other one is which policy design principle is the policy meeting or violating? Both of those go back to the beginning of class, the 10 economic principles and the 6 design principles. Then you also have to ask, is it effective, efficient, and equitable? And to be able to do that, you of course have to look across scales. We looked at one concept which was pretty interesting to think about the local, state, and federal scales, and that we were looking at biomass, transportation, and for the big 18-wheelers, all those roads, local, state, and federal, have different gross weight limits. So if you are a truck and you going to have to go across all those areas, there's a policy for each of those locations. So you might be able to carry a lot in a federal land highway, but you can't carry anywhere near that about on local. So you have to look at where all the policies are going to be affected. Oh, and then we looked at this article that was really cool on supply chain policies. So they went through the entire supply chain and addressed wherever the policies were. Most of the policies were in the manufacturing aspect, and they were mostly tax incentives. There was nowhere near the number of policies addressed to the raw production part of it, and in this case was trees and harvesting trees. And there was very little in the transportation, and there also wasn't very much on the product end. So if you look at the entire supply chain, you can find out which policies are being addressed and which gaps need to be addressed. Okay, got all that stuff. Oh, and then we went on to palm oil. So this one was really fascinating. The oil palm, it's not a tree because it doesn't have any actual wood. It only grows in the tropics. It is being grown, well, it is a issue for deforestation because palm oil became very profitable. Part of that was from the push to create biofuels, and that ended up meaning that they were doing a lot of slash and burn in the tropics so that they could plant these palm trees. And the slash and burn not only destroyed native forests, but they were then burning peat, which is not normally burned because we're in the tropics and it's usually wet, so they don't have fires there. And that was creating extreme carbon issues because of all the burn peat. But the disturbing thing is that one of the reasons that they use so much palm oil is because it's 9 times more productive than any other plant. So they are producing this Rspo, which is the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. It is a non-state certification process, and it is intended to look into the entire supply chain from the beginning to the end. It's a little more difficult because palm oil has to be processed, so it's not like coffee where you can just buy certified coffee, and yet there are definitely products that have a little asterisk on the ingredients that says organic palm oil or certified palm oil, and I pay more for organic products because I believe they help the environment, but they don't help the farmer. So that was one of the things in the paper was they call those farmers the smallholders, and that had small farms. They are participating in the certification. They get some social benefits out of it, but they don't get any money benefits out of it. So during class, I was thinking about this trickle-down theory, and I feel like the Colorado River is a very good example, that from the snowpack in the Rockies, as the river goes all the way down, all these people along the way take something out of it, and by the time it's supposed to get to Mexico and get to the ocean, there's no more water left. And that's kind of what I felt like happens with the farmers that are producing this palm oil. All right, our word for ecological economics is degrowth, and that is more about sufficiency than efficiency. The problem with green growth is it is about efficiency, but most of the time that is then reinvested in more consumption or more growth rather than reducing our impact. I really like this quote from the conversation.com. The very lifestyles that were once considered the definition of success are now proving to be our greatest failure. So think about degrowth and being sufficient. All right, moving on to my independent class. My professor said once again, I need to come up with a question. He has told me this for about 6 weeks, and I have come up with different questions every 6 weeks. But we're getting closer to an appropriate question. He gave me this really cool example of an hourglass, and the top of it is, like, for my project, why should we care about wildernesses? What are some of the challenging issues facing wilderness is? One of those issues would be pollution. Some visitors argue that pollution is increased by visitor increases. Well, how does that impact management issues? And how does it directly impact visitors and how they associate it with the wilderness, and how all that happens in one location. And down at the very skinniest part of the hourglass is supposed to be my question. And then the cool thing is, as you go down into the bottom half of the hourglass, you begin to say, how does my question connect to the global issues of wilderness and the ability to manage it? And also what happens if we lose that connection of visitors to wilderness areas? He said, in the pursuit of this specific question, I will find out how complicated an answer is. Cha-ching, yes, that's definitely happening. And he said within that is a place of humility. He said his original MBA was, he originally got a master's in business, and he said that it is not an aspect of humility, but in science, you see the depth of complexity, and it does create humility. So one of the things I'm supposed to be doing is wrapping up why used toilet paper is an issue, why now, why in wilderness areas, and what are the solutions and how will I tell them, even though I will have incomplete answers. So all that wraps up to be, why am I doing what I'm doing? So maybe by next week I can tell you my research question. The word for the independent class is rigor. It is a strict adherence to truth, and I liked this overall point from the Electronic Journal of Biotechnology. It is, we disrobe ourselves of our prejudices. We search for all possible explanations. All right, so the haiku for this week is, down to one closet and 17 syllables, it's a simple life. That is by Juliana Howard, and I feel like that sums up, haikus are rigorous because they have the framework, and I feel like that also sums up the concept of degrowth. So, plant some more flowers. Have a great week. Bye.